The T1 Ref is a very interesting case, and there is a lot to like about this one. So today let's take a look at the features, the configurations, and the performance. Welcome to Machines More. We've done a few videos on the FormD T1 reference edition already, including the detailed build guide and a look at the C14S, but today we're going to do the full review and the evaluation for this sub 10 liter case. A big thanks to FormD for providing this case for the review today, and as with all my product reviews on the channel, I'm not paid by the manufacturer for the review. They are completely independent, and I hope to give you the most objective and well-researched opinion. Start a little background. The T1 Ref is the traditional layout option that you can choose from within the FormD T1 family. Traditional here meaning that you have your board mounted to the outer panel of your case, and your graphics card slots into the expansion slot directly without a riser cable. And the power supply in this version is mounted next to the motherboard, so that looks a lot like the NR200 and the NK1 layout. Not too long ago, we looked at the T1 V2 in the sandwich flavor. These two cases share an identical outer form factor, and they share a lot of common parts. The case does come flat packed, and you have to assemble it yourself. So if you're looking for a turnkey case to build in, maybe this isn't the case for you, but for me, and I think many of you, you will enjoy the process because it's like double the fun, right? You get to build the case, and then you get to build in the case. In addition, since we are talking about pretty compact dimensions, it's easier at certain points to build the case as you are building in the case. So it's kind of like this synergy that happens here. The outer dimensions measure in at 335 millimeters long, 220 millimeters tall without the feet, and a measly 135 millimeters wide. And that translates to pretty restrictive component clearances, particularly the GPU. You have to have a 2-slot card, and according to FormD specifications list, the width of the card has to be 112 millimeters or less. For reference, if you saw the first build video, I managed to fit the 117 millimeter wide Gigabyte Gaming OC 3060 Ti into the case, and at first I couldn't get that supporting bar in place, but after reconfiguring the cables a little bit, it could work, but not without a good amount of pressure from the cables against the side panels. So I'd say 112 millimeters, it's a pretty safe number to go by, and even that still depends on the location of the GPU's power cable connectors as well, since if the connector is placed the cables too far out, that's going to interfere with the side panel closing as well. So I'm not going to recommend that you run something like that 3060 Ti Gaming OC, even though I was able to make it fit marginally. So for the thermal testing portion of the review, I did also fit this EVGA 3080X E3 card into here, but that card, it's a bit thicker than 2 slots, and the fans are a hair away from rubbing against the top panel, so definitely stick with that 2-slot recommendation here. Ampere FE cards such as the 3080 and 3080 Ti are noted to fit in this case as well, even with that 12-pin to dual 8-pin adapter cable. The other width-oriented spec here is the cooler clearance. For air coolers measuring, that is a little bit more straightforward. It's just the max height of the unit. Usually it's your heat sink, and that's 115 millimeters. You do have some choices here. For towers, you got the ID Cooling SE904XT, which is 110. SS110 from Thermalright is 110. D9L is 110. If you want to run a top-down cooler, the C14S that we looked at in the last video is going to be the biggest you can fit, but only in the low profile mode. For liquid cooling, since your radiator mounts to the side, that 115 millimeters is going to mean the height of your radiator, the fans, and your CPU block unit, that's going to have to add up to less than that. And you still want airflow clearance too, right? And plenty of units with 30 millimeters or thinner radiators will clear, but you do have to consider the clearance over the power supply also if you're running a 240 or a 280. And there's about 60 millimeters of space there. And again, you still want to leave room for airflow as well. So ideally here, 27 millimeter rad, 25 millimeter fans. Not all 280s are going to clear. Mine was a 317 millimeter long radiator, and that required removal of the top right radiator mounting point. Most folks will want to run a mini-itx board. You can theoretically fit a mini-itx board in here, and I would strongly recommend an SFX power supply for graphics card clearance. The SFX-L form factor, although supported, will be overly tight if you plan on running a card that will overlap into that power supply bottom section there. When you get the case, everything is neatly arranged into trays. The case components are very nicely machined and finished. One of the things I really enjoyed about putting the T1 V2 together was appreciating the finish quality on each component, and this case definitely gives you the same warm, fuzzy vibes. The main structural component here is the side panel that the motherboard and the power supply attaches to. This one does have holes drilled for standoffs and screws, so it's not the same as the one on the Sandwich Edition. And it's also machined for the graphics card to poke through as well. You got two little holes there. So it's a panel that's unique to the Reference Edition. This mates to the same front panel as the Sandwich Edition would. And you also have the Reference Edition's rear panel, which sports a large cutout for potential C14S heat pipe tips facing out configurations. When you're getting ready to close up the case, the structural side support can then go in, and if you're using the radiator or the fan panel, that attaches to that side support bar, in addition to one point at the rear, one point at the front, using that attachment bracket. When you're ready to close up shop, got two panels here. You can choose whichever side you want to face up. These are the same top and bottom as the Sandwich version, and a steel side panel will slot into those two panels. With the Reference Edition, you don't get a choice of side panel. It's only available with the steel one, which is a little heavier, but it also feels very sturdy, and it's magnetic if you've got accessories that attach magnetically. It's handy. For more assembly details, feel free to take a look at the build video, but overall the assembly experience is very straightforward. The case is less complicated than the Sandwich version, and building in this one isn't bad either. As long as you have a basic understanding about how to do a PC build, you should be able to manage this one just fine. And the air-cooled build was very elegant though, compared to the liquid-cooled build. One thing I did leave to the very end for both air and liquid-cooled builds was the cooler itself. Now for air coolers, it really helps to leave the heatsink. That's going to obstruct your activity inside the case. Leave that to the very end. Even getting the graphics card into this case and lined up to those two holes at the side panel, it's easier without the heatsink there potentially ruffling up your knuckles. And for liquid cooled builds, like with an AIO, the best way to manage the tubes in the limited space is to curl it up around the CPU block. And that also means that your radiator is going to have limited travel once you mount up the pump head. So it's really going to help if it's the second to last thing you do before screwing down the rad panel along with the radiator and closing it all up. In sub 10 liters, you usually don't have too many considerations for how to direct airflow. And usually there's only one or two ways to do it at all, and one good way and one bad way. But this case is very special because there's quite a variety of options in cooling, so we really should spend a bit of time and discuss cooling configurations. So the first thing is the GPU cooling. If you're running a GPU in this case, I'd pretty much universally recommend that you place it on top, just like that. Compared to how most PC cases are traditionally displayed, this is called inverted, and it's really easy to configure the T1 Reference Edition this way, since you just place the top panel over the GPU and the bottom panel on the other end, and then close it up the same way. With SFF cases that have more fan options as well as more elevation off the desk, this inversion tends to have a little bit less efficacy. But with the T1 Reference, there is a big difference, and I'd argue it's almost a necessity. The main thing is if you're running a GPU, most likely it's going to be a 2-slot card, so you're nearly maximizing the thickness in that section already. And with such low clearance from the feet, if you were to put it on the bottom, that card's not going to draw any air, or hardly any air, so the cooling really will be compromised. Placing the card at the top means that it will have a much easier time accessing intake air, and for the most part this doesn't impact CPU temps too much. So if you are unsure when you're building up your case the first time, my default recommendation would be to start by placing the top panel over the GPU. For the CPU cooling, let's get to air cooling first, because I had a flow-through section on the first test GPU with the 3060 Ti here. With the tower cooler build, I ran the fan to intake from the rear of the case, and that side panel fan exhausting. And that airflow configuration evacuates some GPU exhaust and CPU exhaust through the side panel. Over time, this is going to trap dust in the case since the panel is filtered, so just be aware of that. You're going to have to be on top of your cleaning. Not too difficult because this case is easy to disassemble and clean it out. But you could also reverse the airflow if you wanted. You can intake through the side, exhaust the tower cooler through the rear, and just be aware that in a combined scenario such as gaming, the CPU cooling, it's going to be adversely affected by the GPU, especially if you have a flow-through GPU cooler that is fairly commonplace these days. One thing is, if you have an NVIDIA Founders Edition card that relies heavily on that flow-through section, absolutely do not run rear exhaust mode. The maximum level of air cooling in this case is the C14S from Noctua. Now this is a cooler that perfectly fits within the height restriction here, in low profile mode only, which is the fan underneath the heatsink. I did a whole video on that, so I won't reiterate too much here. I'll just direct you to that. But there are a few ways to run the airflow. The way I would recommend to balance things out would be to intake from the fan at the cooler, run your panel case fan as an exhaust, especially if you have a flow-through cutout on your graphics card. And that's gonna be a good balance there for your case thermals. For the configuration testing, I only tested with a 240 here. It shouldn't be too much difference for a 280. So you can either run the fans in exhaust or intake from the side panel. What intaking does, it's feeding cooler air to the radiator first, and there is a big swing for CPU temps. In theory, the one thing that exhaust at the radiator can do is prioritize the GPU's cooling, since by exhausting through the radiator, those fans are helping to draw air in through the GPU's cooler and also evacuate the GPU's waste heat. But there is a pretty disproportionate penalty to the CPU cooling with a hot card, like the Test 3080 here. The radiator kind of segments the case up into two parts, so the effect is not as pronounced here, and so there's not that huge of a benefit to the GPU. The board power here for the test card is about 325 watts, so we are already seeing close to the worst case scenario that you can fit into more or less 2 slots, and it's still usable, I think, in radiator intake mode. I think given that, my recommendation would be to set up the rad fans to intake. If anything, you can dial down the rad fan speeds a little bit and then up the GPU fan speeds a little as needed to balance things out. One additional thing is that in these tight quarters, if you're going to run exhaust, your fan blades will be a bit more exposed unless you run fan grills. There's not too much space here, so I would lean towards just zip tying those tubes down like this to avoid hitting the fans. As for 240 versus 280 rad, well, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And of course, I am running NFA 12x25s on my 240 for test consistency that you'll see soon enough against other SFF cases. But noise normalized testing here, a 240 with good fans, it's going to beat a 280 with stock fans. I don't think CPU performance in a CPU-only usage scenario is going to make it or break it for that particular decision. And one thing is, at this point, there simply are more performance 120mm fan options than there are 140s. You know, we have Noctua performance 140mm fans on the horizon. You've got the Silent Wings for 140s, so that is quickly changing though. One direct thermal impact from 280 is that the more sealed off nature of that 280 rad in this case means that the GPU, it's even more cut off from the rest of the case, and you've got this phenomenon where it's sitting in more of its waste heat. So in addition to the fact that 280 is simply more bulky and may require more concessions to fit, that's going to have a bigger implication to your decision, I think. And I did have to remove the rad attachment point to fit the 280 here. So my recommendation would be, unless you've got a 280 that fits already, go with a 240 and upgrade your fans as needed. It is super insane that a 280 fits in this sub 10 liter case though. Alright, so with those thermal results, we can then pivot and compare against the spectrum of other SFF cases. What's really impressive here is that the PL240 cooler in the T1 reference, it gets very close to the NR200, which is equipped with 4 additional case fans. And since it does have the benefit of 2 25mm thick fans. It also beats out the T1V2 sandwich for your CPU only performance in the intake configuration. So both these cases represent the upper echelon for CPU only cooling. The GPU performance in a combined scenario is where you're going to see some of the thermal limitations of this particular reference design. Things are to start very much tilted towards CPU cooling with the RAD intake configuration though. So if you look at the CPU temps, they are quite a bit better than any other case here. So of course for gaming, your GPU temps are going to be the more pertinent metric. So I do keep these fan speeds locked for consistency of comparison between cases, but what this tells us is that you could theoretically dial down the radiator fan speeds, up the GPU fan speeds a little bit, and you're gonna get a much more balanced result. At any rate, with how good the CPU temps are here, this isn't necessarily a bad result. The cases that you do want to watch out for are those that have higher CPU temps coupled with higher GPU temps, since you won't be able to rebalance those thermals that way. So in the combined stress test, again, we're seeing similar results. The interesting thing is just how good the CPU temps still are. They really are phenomenal, and I think a lot of that comes into the way the radiator segments the case into these two separate compartments. The radiator and fan thickness basically divides the case into two discrete chambers. So on one hand, your radiator and intake, it runs great, it's taking care of itself, and it's unimpeded by the graphics card. And in the other virtual chamber, you've got the GPU, which unfortunately it's suffering a little bit more because of the limited airflow it has. So even when the RAD is set up to exhaust, the impact on the GPU, it's still minimal because of that phenomenon here. So intake, probably still the better choice here, like I mentioned. So overall, with an AIO, you've got insanely good CPU temps, not so great GPU temps before you balance the fan curves a little bit. That being said, unless you're running a workstation type of build in this case, I don't think the AIO would be my first choice for cooling this case, because for the T1 ref, the C14S, I think is a much better choice between the two, despite it being limited to only the low profile configuration. Your CPU temps are not flat out better with the C14S, but they are still competitive, and the cooler would still be pretty usable with plenty of powerful CPUs today. But the kicker though is the combined temps are much more balanced because we have that case fan and just a bit more room for the CPU to stretch its legs. So I say for the most part, within the context of the T1 family, the C14S inside the T1 ref, it's actually going to yield the best results with a component choice featuring a moderate CPU and a hotter or moderate to hot GPU. And in the combined scenarios here, the C14S, it's yielding better CPU temps than the T1 sandwich equipped with an AIO. And since one of the marquee features here is that the C14S fits in this T1 reference case, that's a really compelling option. And one more thing is that C14S, it's gonna come in a little bit cheaper than the AIO, even if you have to buy another 25mm fan for it. So overall, there's not much to dislike about this case. You've got excellent build quality, and I have very little to nitpick, but the power button on my test unit, if you saw the initial review, I pointed out that power button did have a thick heat shrink around the cable connection, and that made the power button pretty sticky when it was mounted. It does work, but you feel it. It's harder to depress, and I know this because of my experience with how crisp the T1 sandwich's power button is. And this might seem like a little thing until you're reminded of that every time you turn the machine on, right? It's that one touch point on the case. It just had to be that, right? But I'm sure if you had this issue on yours, FormD would take care of you. You don't get any other front I/O unless you option on a USB-C front header, and that'll attach to the front panel, so that's another thing to note. No other front I/O. The one design choice that I have feedback on is the attachment for the radiator panel. I don't think it's insecure as it is, but I do wonder if there's a way to secure the radiator directly at a second point along the front panel, but there's very little play here. It's not the end of the world, but personally, I would like an attachment point where that would firm it all up completely. So who's this case for? Well, assuming a user that wants a premium level case in the sub 10 liter realm, perhaps the biggest qualifier or perhaps hurdle here is the graphics card limitation. If you have or you're planning on getting a narrow 2-slot card that fits in this case, this is going to be a fantastic case for you. If that's you, I'd choose the T1 Reference Edition over the sandwich. It's also $30 cheaper as well, and you don't need a riser cable, which is going to eliminate some potential headaches. And I think if you want to do some simple but effective air cooling within this case, it's a bit easier to set up as well without having to worry too much about clearances like you might have to in the T1 Sandwich Edition. With the excellent CPU thermal performance potential, it's also well suited to CPU heavy users, and it's really no slouch for gaming purposes as well. Perhaps you're doing a rendering workstation build that's tilted towards a powerful CPU like a 7950X or 13900K, and you want to pair it with a smaller GPU like an RX 6600 or a 3060 Ti. This is going to be perfect. Although there is the question of storage for a workstation. With the cost and prevalence of M.2 drives now, it's not as big of an issue if you have the capability on your motherboard. But if you want to run 2.5-inch SSDs, you're going to have to be a bit more creative for internal storage. And probably the easiest way is just to double stick tape a drive or two to your power supply. Kind of janky, but it works. I've done that before. If you don't have a GPU, obviously your options open up quite a bit, and you can mount HDDs if you want. But for sure though, this case is not one that is rich on storage options. Neither do we expect it to be, because in this sub-10 realm, we're already aware of the limitations in this volume category. Traditional layout in this volume, while supporting a 280 or a C14S, is simply unbelievable, not to mention the level of quality, the minimalist looks here, and that this case shares parts and a form factor with a sandwich-style sibling is a true testament to the ingenuity of the design here. It's just so well designed. This gives way to a full portfolio within the T1 family while keeping manufacturing costs streamlined, and the T1 Reference bears what I would consider a very reasonable price for this level of case. You got $175 for the black version and $190 for the titanium version I have here, plus give or take $35 for shipping to the US as a reference point. And the only hurdle, can you get one? The availability, it's getting better. For me though, as an enthusiast, this case has been so much fun to tinker with. It's really been a while since I've had this much fun with a case, not because it's been fun gaming with it, but just because of the sheer number of possibilities and the options. And this I would rank right up alongside the M1 here and the NR200 for the fun factor. Possibly higher because I really enjoy the exquisite build quality of this one. And if you're like me, or you might just want to try different things in your build and play around with different components from time to time, this case is highly recommended. I do want to go full custom loop in this later on. The width here might make things a little bit tricky, so it'll take some careful part selections and planning, but I am looking forward to that challenge. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Build links in the description. Please give a like if you enjoyed this review, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.